Welcome again to the Medical Terminology Podcast. This episode is Chapter 4, Part 1, Word Parts relating to the muscular system. Well, what I'm going to do with you is, as in previous episodes, review the various word parts for Chapter 4. What is the word part that refers to muscle? Well, the primary one is myo, M-Y/O. Most of the terms are going to use that word part. There is one other word part that is also used in some terms, and that's myocele, M-Y-O-S/O. What is the word part that refers to fascia? That's fascio, F-A-S-C-I/O. And do you remember what a fascia is? The fascia is a sheet of connective tissue that covers, supports, and separates muscles from each other and other tissues. What is the word part that refers to tendon? Well, that's tenno, T-E-N/O. We also have a couple of alternate word parts, tendino, T-E-N-D-I-N/O, and its primary use is in the term tendinitis. And we also have tendo, T-E-N-D/O. Again, this is a situation where most of the time we're going to use tenno, T-E-N/O, but you do need to be aware of the other word parts, and you do need to know the particular terms that do use those. Okay, and while we're on the subject, do you remember what a tendon is? Well, a tendon is a type of connective tissue that attaches a muscle to a bone. This is different from the ligament, which is part of the skeletal system. A ligament attaches bone to bone, but a tendon attaches muscle to bone, hence it's part of the muscular system. Now I'd like to go over 3 word parts that all relate to muscle motion or the control of motion. The first word part is relating to muscle tone. Do you remember the word part that relates to muscle tone? Well, that's tono, T-O-N/O. And muscle tone is the relative tension in a muscle between contraction and relaxation. And we normally think of the tone as being the state of calm or relaxation. In other words, you're not trying to move the muscle, it's just sitting there. Tone is how normally contracted it is versus how normally relaxed it is. If it's totally relaxed, it's going to be floppy, and your arm or whatever the muscle's attached to is just going to flop all over the place. So there's always some amount of contraction in a muscle. That's what we're talking about with muscle tone. The next word part relates to coordination. That is the ability to coordinate motion of a muscle. Do you remember what that word part is? Well, that is taxo, TAX/O. And finally, we have a word part that relates to motion or movement, and this is specifically the ability to move or the ability to have motion in a muscle. Do you remember that word part? Well, that one is kinesio, KINESI/O. And a fairly common word in the vernacular is kinesiology, and that is the study or the specialty of motion, how the body moves. Okay, that does it for the combining forms. Now there are two prefixes I would like to review with you briefly because they compose a couple of important terms that we're going to see and talk about in another podcast episode. Do you remember the prefix that means away from? Well, that is ab, A-B. And the mnemonic for this, remember, is abstain. If you abstain from something, you're staying away from it. Now, the opposite of that is towards. Do you remember what the prefix is that means towards? Well, that's going to be add, A-D. And the mnemonic for that is the word addiction. If you're addicted to something, you are pulled towards it. You can't help yourself. Two important prefixes. We're going to see those in the words abduction and adduction, which we're going to focus on in another episode. Okay, and that leads us to the suffixes. And as you hopefully remember, suffixes most of the time are going to be relating to pathologies or conditions. So we're going to go over those now. There is a suffix in the chapter that means hernia. And when we use the term hernia in this chapter, it's used in a rather broad general sense. The definition they give us is that a hernia is a protrusion of a part through tissues that are normally containing it. And that's very general. We could mean any part, any tissues. Now, normally when we use the term hernia in the common vernacular, we're thinking of like an abdominal hernia. We're thinking of like when the gut, the bowel, would be protruding through the abdominal wall in various places. For example, an inguinal hernia. When we're using the word hernia in this chapter, yes, we could mean that because a hernia like that is a structure protruding through tissue that contains it, but it can also mean other types of things. So you want to get out of your mind that notion of the abdominal hernia when we're talking about hernia. Now, do you remember the suffix that does refer to hernia? Well, that's cell, -C-E-L-E. And in this chapter, we have the term myocele, which would refer to the protrusion of a muscle through its sheath. Okay, and then we have three more suffixes that we can group together because they're all related to paralysis or weakness or relative strength of a muscle. The first suffix refers to paralysis. Do you remember the suffix for paralysis? Well, that's plegia, -P-L-E-G-I-A. Plegia means paralysis. Now we also have a suffix that means partial paralysis, not total paralysis, but just some degree of paralysis. Do you remember that suffix? Well, that is paresis, 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 meaning partial paralysis. And finally, we have a suffix that means weakness in a muscle or a lack of strength. Do you remember what that suffix is? That is asthenia, Asthenia. Asthenia meaning weakness or lack of strength. Now we have 3 more suffixes that I'd like to review with you. These actually are from chapter 1. They should be something you know, but I just want to review them because they seem to appear a lot in this chapter. First of all, we have many suffixes relating to the meaning pertaining to. The suffix means something pertains to something else. And there are a lot of them in the appendix. There are a couple of them that are most commonly used. Do you remember those? Well, we have ic, -ic, and we have all, -al. Either one of these suffixes means pertaining to, and there seem to be a lot of terms in this chapter that have those suffixes in them. And finally, we have one more suffix that means condition. And we're not talking about abnormal condition. We're talking about just the general concept of a condition of some type. Do you remember the suffix that means a condition of some type? Well, that's ia, -ia. Okay, well that's a review of the word parts from chapter 4. Again, if you can get these down, you'll go a long way towards understanding and being able to reproduce the terms from chapter 4. This ends this episode of the Medical Terminology Podcast.